How do you lift a vehicle and save money at the same time? I came across this question the other day on one of the forums that I frequent. The user had a Toyota Tundra that he really liked. He wanted to lift it and add larger tires, but he wasn't sure how to go about it. He couldn't quite discern what parts were super necessary to a lift, what were accessories, what was the actual meat and potatoes of lifting his truck, and how should he go about it if he was going to be budget minded and was price shopping. This is a great question for a lot of people who are just lifting their truck for the first time. There are so many different parts. There's just too much information to wade through and too many decisions to make for you to be confident in what to get. I'm going to explain the basics, the beginnings of what you need to know to lift your truck and what's absolutely important and what you can save for later and how you can be smart and save money along the way. The goal that we're looking for here is some kind of 75% solution to our vehicle. We want the vast majority of benefits that come from modifying it, from lifting it, from adding larger tires, but maybe we don't want to spend all the money and go through all the parts that are required to squeeze every last drop of performance out of our suspension and tires. Before going any further, we should go take a look at the front end of a Toyota, look at all the different suspension components, and understand how that works, what we're trying to accomplish before we start looking at different parts and different prices. Let's go take a look at my truck. Okay, here is the front suspension. We're going to show this at a couple different angles to start with. Here's a side view and kind of a back view here. All right, so let's take a look at our front suspension here. Let's start at the top. So this is our strut mount, which mounts our strut, or some people refer to this as a coilover. You can swap out springs out of these struts to get different lift heights, etc. This is responsible for ride quality, lift height, and weight capacity. Upper control arm right here. This has two bushings, one back here where it mounts the vehicle. This is your upper ball joint. This is considered your spindle. This entire assembly is sometimes called your hub or your knuckle assembly. This whole mechanism here, this front suspension, is what causes input that the tire takes from the terrain to go through your suspension into the body of the truck and affects how the truck rides and everything, how it handles, corners, all of that is run through this right here. This is the lower control arm. Right here on my Tundra, this is where the bump stop lands. So the bump stop's right here. This is what stops your up travel. This stops the suspension assembly from pushing all of this stuff upward, right? So it goes down or up. This entire assembly goes at different angles as you lower and lift the vehicle. On my Tundra, there's a brake line that runs right through here. So from the caliper up through here. So depending on your suspension components, it's possible that you could rub on this brake line. If something got wider or longer, that might happen. Brake caliper rotor, not really part of your suspension, but it lives in the same area. My lower shock mount, my bushing, this lower control arm has a bushing here and a bushing here. One of your alignment components is right over here. This affects how the vehicle's aligned. A bolt runs through here, it's lobes, a bushing, and it basically rotating it changes how far forward or how far back this control arm gets pushed. Same thing on the back side back here. Then we have our CV axle right here. So this is what transfers power from the differential to the hub to the tire in order so that you can drive. In four-wheel drive, your CV axle is going to transfer power from the front differential to your tire so that you have your front tires pulling as well as your rear tires. In two-wheel drive, this just passively spins. Since there's no manual hubs or electronic disconnect, this will spin even when you're in two-wheel drive. And then down here on the bottom is your lower ball joint, which connects the lower control arm to the knuckle. If it fails, it's awful. So make sure you put OEM ball joints, lower ball joints on these, because if they fail, the failure is awful. So for all the parts that we just saw in that demonstration, there's going to be an aftermarket solution for them. There's going to be something geared towards making the part stronger, making the part work with larger tires, or making the part work with extended suspension travel or more extreme suspension angles. Since all those front end components are tied together, when you add larger or heavier tires, when you add lockers, when you add any kind of suspension lift or longer travel, those parts are all going through new angles and stresses that maybe they haven't experienced before or they weren't experiencing as often as before. Aftermarket parts galore here. You could swap out just about everything on the front end with an aftermarket part that's designed to be higher performance. But our goal in saving money is to not have to do that. Let's get into suspension, which is probably everybody's favorite modification. There's nothing more universally loved than a lifted pickup truck. We love how it looks, how it changes the vehicle, how all of a sudden there's all this room in the wheel well that we get to fill up with these meaty tires, but it is complicated. So we're gonna dispel all the different parts here and talk about what really needs to get modified if we want to be lifted and what's kind of an option. So let's dive into that. When it comes to suspension, there are 2, maybe 3 different kind of build philosophies. If you are interested in going fast in a vehicle on off-road terrain, you are entering what is almost exclusively a pay-to-play game. You either need to buy a vehicle from the factory that is modified to do this, you need to buy a vehicle that somebody else has modified to do this, or you need to be ready to pony up and pay a lot for expensive long travel components, etc., etc. That is a pay-to-play game in the off-road world. There's no really budget way to hack into the go fast, jump high, beat on your vehicle, eat up whoops territory of off-roading. You're gonna pay out the nose to get all that done, and you're gonna pay even more if you have to pay someone to do the labor for it. That's an expensive pay-to-play game, tens of thousands of dollars to do it right. On the other hand, if you like camping, you like slow off-roading, hauling things off-road, going up Forest Service roads, camping, overlanding, whatever you like to call it, you're in luck. There's a large gradient of modifications you can choose to do and choose not to do and still end up having a really good time. That's the world that almost everybody is in, and if you're into the other stuff, there's plenty of content to go look at and dissect there. I'm not going to touch it. The number one thing that we're really looking for from our suspension is a little bit of ground clearance and a little bit of increased weight capacity. Some people have the misnomer that they want to fit larger tires. Doing a 2-inch suspension lift isn't really going to change your tire fitment, because if you're going off-road, that tire is going all the way up into the fender well, and you have the same problem you would have had if you're on stock suspension. But the ground clearance is helpful as long as we don't eat up too much of our down travel by lifting too far. We can end up with some performance gains there by adding ground clearance. What we're also looking for here is increased weight capacity. We're probably going to be adding armor of some sort, or we're going to be carrying people, and we're definitely going to be carrying gear if we're doing these excursions. And so we need suspension that's going to handle this. It's not going to fatigue. It's going to put up to some of this abuse. So the big thing that I want to communicate here is that lifting the vehicle higher and higher and higher has diminishing returns. The higher we lift the vehicle, generally the worse results we can expect. By choosing a higher lift height, you're just increasing the angle that all those different front end components sit at. CV axles, control arms, tie rods. The more you lift your suspension, especially in the front, the more you just make a mess. Now these parts we're all talking about, they're from the factory made to ride at these flat or nearly flat levels for most of their life. So when we lift a vehicle, we change it so that they're constantly riding at these angles. We can expect that they're probably not going to last as long, and the wear on them is going to be more severe. For all of these reasons, I don't really recommend going above 2 inches in lift height. Going above 2 inches generally will start creating problems that need more aftermarket parts to fix the problems you're creating by adding the initial aftermarket part that lifts the vehicle. You go through this parts rabbit hole where suddenly all these angles are not maintainable, and you start adding new parts. You start adding CV boots, you start adding aftermarket upper control arms, so on and so forth, and you spend a lot more money just by making that initial modification. So let's look at some of the benefits that we can gain by going to about 2 inches or slightly lower in terms of lift height. Generally, on a 2-inch or lower lift, you're going to be able to keep the stock upper control arm. Now there's kind of this misnomer. In general, an aftermarket upper control arm is probably a stronger part and a slightly better design in terms of strength, maybe the bushings they're using, but keep in mind there's nothing actually wrong with the factory upper control arm. There's nothing like flawed about the design. They work, they're good arms. The problem is they're not made to ride at 2+ inches of lift. They're not designed to deal with those angles. If you keep it below 2 inches, generally that upper control arm will work and things won't be so far out of whack that you can still get a good alignment. Generally, the main difference between a stock and an aftermarket upper control arm is that the aftermarket ones are bent or can be adjusted to compensate for the changes in suspension geometry that occur when lifting. You can get an alignment using factory upper control arms if you keep the lift below 2 inches generally. At 1.5 inches or 1 inch, you're definitely going to be safe. Depending on the suspension you add and the height you go, I have seen issues where the upper control arm will contact your suspension at full droop. I haven't had this issue. It seems to be something that happens when you really lift the vehicle high or you use certain suspension combinations. But going lower levels of lift, I haven't seen this issue. That being said, most people who I see go with full adjustable coilover, seem to go with a uniball or some other kind of upper control arm and do what's considered mid-travel, which is a great option, but it is not a budget suspension necessarily. In the 2-inch range, we still have some really reputable companies. Bilstein 5100s, Bilstein 6112s, Old Man Emus, Dobinsons, Eibach makes a setup. Like, these are all great options in the economical range. They're gonna work great. You're gonna actually like the ride quality, you're gonna like the performance. It's not cheap rough country or rancho stuff necessarily. These are reputable brands making good products. You can save money here by getting one that's already assembled. It already comes with the coil you want. It already comes with the strut you want. And you can spend as little as I've seen, like $500, $600, $700 to get a fully assembled one that doesn't need to be worked on by a shop. You can just bring it somewhere or install it yourself without dealing with coil compressors. That's the way to go in my opinion for saving time and money. I have 5100s with an Old Man Emu spring. They've been great so far. Another benefit that comes from keeping our lift height under 2 inches is less CV axle wear. So the CV axles are going to last longer, and it's less likely that we're going to need to swap out the boots to some kind of high angle boot. On the first gen Tundra, for example, there's people who swap Porsche CV axle boots onto our CV axles because they're higher performance, better rubber. They can endure those extreme angles that come from lifting a vehicle. If you keep your lift height low, you won't need these kind of aftermarket solutions to compensate for that lift. In my opinion, we don't really need extended sway bar links here either. So far, I've done some pretty decent off-roading. I've done chicken corners, I've done some trails in Arizona. I've done plenty of time in Idaho and Colorado. I make my suspension cycle, I take it off-road, I haven't needed extended sway bar links. Nothing's broken, cracked, popped. It's been totally fine. So I don't think you have to plan on buying extended sway bar links or changing out your front sway bar. The upper and lower ball joints are also gonna be fine. There's not gonna be any issues here. They can all survive these angles. The upper ball joint's fine, the lower ball joint's fine. Keep that OEM though, because you don't want that thing to fail. You're not gonna experience any super excessive wear on your wheel bearings, anything from your spindles that they can't handle. If you start jumping your truck, you're gonna run into problems. There's a lot of things that you just don't have to mess with here. You don't need longer brake lines because you haven't changed the range of travel on your front suspension. You kept it super simple. You could be sitting here with a lifted front end for under $1,000 all in. Parts, labor, everything. Mine was well under that. In my own experience, that's what it was. Even having to have the struts installed somewhere else and then aligned there, I was still under $1,000 total. That's a pretty good deal to have a lifted and aligned vehicle that can now support extra weight capacity and drives, handles fine. In my opinion, this is kind of the ultimate budget way to lift a Toyota, is to only buy one part, and that's the strut coilover assembly. Whatever you do, you just make one purchase, or two if you buy them separately, the spring and the strut. You've made one change, you've torn apart the front end once, and you now have a lifted vehicle. As opposed to spending money on all these different aftermarket solutions, you're starting to total in $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 ranges to buy everything and maybe even pay people to help you install them. Add the tires on top and you could be totally lifted, tires, everything, for around $1,500, which is not bad compared to what other people are spending on their vehicles. So the number one place, in my opinion, to spend your money is on tires. Don't cheap out on tires. Get good tires designed for the terrains that you're most interested in, or go for an all-terrain, something that will give you balanced performance in most conditions. Focus on getting a tire with the kind of tread pattern that you need and the kind of performance that you're looking for in an off-road tire. One way to save money here is to simply buy less tire. Either go skinnier or go shorter in overall height. The less tire you're buying, generally the cheaper the price. Say you have your heart set on a set of 35-inch tires. Well, that's great, but for most vehicles, especially older Toyotas that don't have a ton of power, that have smaller brakes, controlling a set of 35-inch tires may be more than you bargained for, especially if this is your first time lifting a vehicle and you don't understand the absolute suck on power that larger tires can be. Maybe start smaller, because if you go down from a 35 to a 33, you're only losing an inch in ground clearance, which it's an inch to give up, but it's not going to be super consequential in terms of what you can do with your vehicle. 33s to 35s, it matters, but there's a lot of cost in going up to 35s, making them fit and making them work. So consider buying 1 or 2 inches smaller of a tire than you had previously planned on. This is a great way to save money without giving up too much in performance. You're going to see better MPG too long term by going with a shorter tire, so you'll save some money down the road as well as up front. Your acceleration, your drivability, the way the vehicle handles will generally be better The other dimension of your tire to consider here is width. A narrow tire is generally going to cost less to buy, and it's going to cost less to fill up your truck if you have narrow tires. They have slightly less rolling resistance, they're going to be lighter, and they're going to have a better aerodynamic profile, so you're going to get better fuel economy. If you don't mind going with a skinny tire, or if you're used to off-roading somewhere where a skinny tire is advantageous, if you're worried about snow or ice performance, there's a lot of arguments that a narrow tire will actually perform better in those. Obviously, if you're on powder, a lot of people maybe like a wider tire. If you're on sand, people like a wider tire. If you're interested in learning more about narrow versus wide tires, Tinkerer's Adventure has a really good video. I'll link that in the description. In terms of off-road performance, there's a lot of arguments for both. Narrow tires tend to air down kind of like a tank track and actually end up with similar contact patches to wide tires. That's the keyword everybody always argues about on tire width. Contact patch. I think there's a lot of speculation, a lot of misnomers, so you can do your own research. But tires is one where people love to get confused and spout information off the top of their head. I'm guilty of that, but I have had both wide and skinny tires. I can't say I notice a big difference in off-road performance, so generally I prefer the more economical skinny tire. I consider a skinny tire to be something under 10 or 11 inches in width, although 11 inches is pretty wide on some vehicles. So definitely under 10 inches is a skinny, and then somewhere between 10 and 11 inches, you kind of hit a normal or a wide tire. For people who are used to seeing metric sizes like 235, 245, 255, those are kind of considered your skinny tire widths. And then 265, 75 start to be in the middle, 85, 95, 305, 315 are definitely wide. Doing the shopping and price comparing for tire sizes, I usually use tiresize.com. They show all kinds of different sizes. You don't just have to go with a 285, 70, 17, even though that seems to be the absolute most popular tire size in the world right now. I don't know why, but the 285, 70, 17 has kind of become the gold standard for off-road tires. They're also wicked expensive. I don't get that. My 235, 85 R16 tires were way cheaper, only about an inch shorter total, so half-inch ground clearance difference, and are going to give me way better gas mileage and more sidewall because I went with a 16 instead of a 17-inch wheel. My tires are Falcon Rubitrex. They've got the 3-peak, no-rated symbol on them. That's kind of the all-terrain tire that I like, is something in that vein, something similar. A BFG KO2, what have you. Another reason to keep your tire width in mind is because the wider you go, the more likely it is to rub on things inside your fender well or even rub on your upper control arm. From what I understand, looking at first-gen Tundras, which run on basically the same suspension as everything else Toyota builds, a 4.5 backspace is generally enough to keep the tire out from rubbing the upper control arm, though you still may have rubbing issues all inside the fender well. The skinnier the tire you go with, the less there is to rub. It's just narrower, and it's not going to contact as many things. Never had to trim or remove my mud flaps. If you keep your skinny tires, if you keep your stock wheels, if you don't use wheel spacers or space your wheels out super far, you'll also have a tighter turning radius, and your scrub radius will stay about the same as it was stock. Now, across all these different models of Toyotas, I can't guarantee tire fitment. I don't know the ins and outs of trimming and hammering fenders on all these different models, but what I can tell you is each time you go up in height and each time you go out in width, you're increasing the chances that you're going to have to trim part of your fender well or even start tubbing your firewalls and doing body mount relocations. That suspension lift, while it looks like you have more room at ride height, ultimately that tire's still got to go all the way up into the fender well at full up travel. So adding a typical suspension lift via a coilover of some kind isn't going to really affect or change how that tire fits at the top of your suspension travel. That point's going to stay similar. So don't get confused and think that lifting your vehicle is going to dramatically change how your tires fit throughout the full range of motion of their travel. It's going to be about the same. So if a tire doesn't fit stock, it's not likely that it's going to fit after a suspension lift. The takeaway here is that the smaller and the lighter we keep the tire, the less we can expect to spend. So people on a budget, unless you're getting cheap tires, which I don't recommend because they won't perform as well, I would get the nicest tread and compound you can afford in a reasonably economical size based on whatever your budget is. My tires were as cheap as $600 or $700, but if you're going for a really popular size or a really expensive tire, you can expect to spend almost $2,000. By doing this, we've also saved money in a few hidden and more subtle ways. For one, our front end parts are just gonna last longer. If we have lighter tires, our steering components aren't gonna wear out as quickly. Our drivetrain isn't going to wear out or tire out either. It's going to be easier on the transmission. It's going to be easier on your differentials if you keep that tire small. Your front end components are also going to last longer the lower you go with your lift. Your tie rod ends, your CV axles, your boots, your sway bar links, your sway bar bushings, your control arm bushings, your lower ball joint, your upper ball joint. The lower you keep the lift, the less stress and novel and new and extreme angles that these things are going to experience. And they're going to last longer. You're going to save more on maintenance by modifying less. You are going to save money in the long run, not constantly replacing front end parts or trying to upgrade them to compensate for the massive tires and the massive lift that you've thrown on a vehicle that already does really well stock. Like, it's a body on frame, 4-wheel drive vehicle. In stock form, most of these Toyotas are going to meet and exceed people's needs, especially if you have one that has a differential locker already from the factory. That thing in stock form is already going to beat my truck, which is open diffs on both ends. It just is. Maybe if I added a winch, I could keep up with you. Suspension, tires, and wheels are places where people love to spend money, but there are very low returns for modifying them in general, especially if you're into any kind of traction-based off-roading where you're going slow, you're going over obstacles. Very, very, very low returns for lifting the vehicle, for adding taller tires in general. Very low to almost no returns for adding most kind of wheels and most kind of suspension lifts. It helps, but it is not the end-all be-all in terms of where your vehicles will be able to get. If you get bead locks, like, yeah, I get it, but the average like method wheel that doesn't have the bead grip technology, your basic whatever discount tire wheel that you're buying aftermarket, not going to improve the performance of the vehicle hardly at all. Unless they're a little lighter, you'll see some returns in fuel economy, but come on, it's not going to add value to your vehicle or anything like that. It's all looks. This skinny tire also allows us to do is retain our factory wheels if we so choose to. Because we're going with a 235, 45, 255 tire, what we can probably do is use our stock 7-inch wide or 8-inch wide Toyota wheel. We don't have to go get new wheels that are 9 inches wide or whatever height. We can use our stock 16, 17-inch wheels, 7 or 8 inches wide, and it'll easily fit and accommodate a lot of these tire sizes that are more economical to purchase and drive on. Not everybody loves stock wheels, but wheels really don't add any capability to your vehicle unless you're buying bead locks. If you're trying to save money, keep your stock wheels, spend heavily on tires, and then get the suspension you need to accomplish what you're trying to do. Obviously, if you have the money, go buy wheels. I didn't have the money for wheels. There's no shame in that. I just like camping. It doesn't mean I suddenly have $1,700 to go spend on a nice pair of methods, and I don't need them. I'm happy with my truck. It just runs, drives, does everything I need it to do. You can spend very little amounts of money and get a truck that is capable, is fun to drive, and takes you exactly where you need to go. Now, if you're interested in learning more about the front end Toyota IFS, I have a video on first gen Tundras that's gonna help give you some visuals on how this all works, what kind of parts you can add. I also have a great review of the Bilstein 5100 shock, which I've had for over a year, over 10, 15,000 miles. Check that out. That is a great resource for people wanting to know what are my thoughts on real world testing of suspension products that I use. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video, and thank you so much for watching. Have a good one.